My husband is hiding something terrifying in his own closet. His disturbing secret ruined our marriage forever, and potentially my life.
Leave a like and subscribe right now. If you do, let me know in the comments below, and I'll reply to your comments saying thanks.
My husband Chris and I have been together for 6 years and married for 11 months. Our entire history together has been very normal, and never once have I noticed any weird behaviors or red flags. I can't stress enough how out of character this whole thing is for him. Chris is very kind, intelligent, and thoughtful. He's always been the no-nonsense type of person. Being childish or trying to scare me is not something he'd normally do. He doesn't even like watching horror movies. When we first started dating, he agreed to watch The Shining with me because he knew how much I loved horror. He was so scared that he didn't even make it through half of the movie before we had to turn it off. He isn't into anything creepy and has never been into pranks. It's just not his cup of tea, and that's fine. But that's what was so strange about this. It's just so unlike him. I should also add that he never had any mental health issues, and as far as I'm aware, it doesn't run in his family. I know some people are able to hide their mental health problems, but in the 6 years we've been together, I think I'd have seen some sort of sign. 2 months ago, I was in the kitchen making myself some coffee before work. I was running a bit late that morning and knew I wouldn't be able to make it to Starbucks for my usual morning fix. I took a sip of my coffee as I hurried down the hall towards the front door when I happened to notice Chris peeking at me from around the corner ahead of me. I could only see his eyes, and a strand of his long, dark hair hanging against the wall. The rest of his body was concealed behind the corner. I nearly spilled my coffee when I saw him. I did burn the heck out of my lips. "Jeezy, Chris," I said, wiping a few drops of coffee from my pants. "You scared the heck out of me." He immediately popped out of view like a little kid that had been caught. I heard him scurry off towards the living room, and by the time I got to the front door, he was out of sight. It was really weird, and just totally out of character for him, like I said. But I also found it kind of funny that he was being more playful and a little less serious. I shouted that I loved him and called him a weirdo. As I shut the door behind me, I heard him laughing. His behavior was a bit odd, but it certainly wasn't something to call a priest over. I forgot about it by lunch, and by the time I got home, he was his normal self. I didn't bring it up, and neither did he, and life went on. The next incident happened 3 days later. It was around 2 a.m., and I had woken up to get a drink. I was standing at the kitchen island, jug of OJ in hand, when I felt a strong feeling that I was being watched. For whatever reason, I looked down at the floor and saw my husband's smiling face staring back. He was peeking at me from the other side of the island, staring up at me with wide, unblinking eyes and grinning like the Cheshire Cat. I screamed, I'll admit it, not out of irritation, but fear. For some reason, at that moment, I was scared. At the sound of my scream, Chris scuttled backwards out of my view, his hands and feet smacking the tile floor as he hurried out of the kitchen on all fours. I didn't run after him, or even yell after him. I just stood there frozen in shock, wondering what frick had possessed him to do that. It took me a little longer than I'd like to admit to go back upstairs, but I eventually did. When I got to our bedroom, Chris was lying on his side, asleep, or at least pretending to be. I stood there for a while, watching him breathing to be sure he really was asleep. I had the feeling he might jump out at me the moment I got into bed, but he didn't. I climbed into bed and he didn't even move. His breathing was soft and deep, and I was starting to wonder if I'd dreamt the whole thing. The next morning, I waited for him to come down for coffee, and after handing him a mug and kissing him cheek, I decided to ask him about it. "What was that about last night?" I asked, keeping my tone light so I didn't offend or embarrass him. He frowned over his cup of coffee, shaking his head like he had no clue what I was referring to. "You were peeking at me again. From over there," I said, pointing to the spot on the floor by the kitchen island. He followed my gaze, and when he looked back at me, he burst out laughing. He laughed so hard that I couldn't help but join him. "You creep me the heck out sometimes, you know that?" I said. He giggled and set his cup on the counter and wrapped his arms around my neck. "You creep me out all the time, so I guess we're even," he teased. We said our goodbyes and left for work. As I drove, I kept thinking about how creepy it had been seeing him grinning at me from behind the island like that. The sounds his hands made on the floor as he crawled away. I told myself he was just trying to be silly, just trying to join me in my love of all things horror. It's not like I was afraid of him, but it still didn't sit right with me. I started seeing him peeking at me more and more. Sometimes he'd be peeking out from behind the couch or living room curtains. Once he even managed to get inside his grandmother's old trunk that sits at the foot of our bed. I might not have even known he was there at all had the trunk's old hinges not given him away. He'd had the lid propped up just enough so that only half of his face peeked through. He'd been grinning like an excited toddler. It was unnerving. I didn't even know what to say to him. All I could do was stare. When I finally found my voice, I asked him why on earth was he doing this. He didn't answer, but he had slowly closed the lid, shutting himself inside the trunk. I just walked away, feeling disturbed. I didn't understand why he was doing it. but it clearly made him happy. I just hoped he would tire of the game quickly. Chris didn't peek at me for the next 2 weeks. I started to think he was done with his weird prank, and I was relieved. We were watching a show on Netflix one night, and I jokingly said that I hadn't seen him peeking at me lately, and that he must have given up on his spy game. He looked up at me with a small smile and said, "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." And I didn't say anything, but I wondered whether or not he was joking. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. Was he still peeking at me when I wasn't looking and I just hadn't noticed? And if so, what the hell was he getting out of this? I started to feel paranoid, constantly checking whether he was watching from around the corner or behind a door. I was jumpy whenever I was home and he wasn't in full view of me. I felt stupid and a little crazy. But after a few weeks without another incident, I began to relax. I stopped checking behind furniture and walls and told myself it was just a bad memory. Then a few days ago, things got so much worse. Chris left to go to a friend's, and I lounged on the couch and played a couple games on my laptop. Around 9 p.m., I hopped in the shower, and as I was washing the soap from my hair, I felt that awful feeling that I was being watched. I slowly opened my eyes and almost had a freaking heart attack. Chris was peeking from behind the shower curtain, his entire head stretched into the shower, leaving just his body outside. His long dark hair hung against the curtain, the ends dripping with water. His mouth hung open in a terrible grin, eyes wide and red, as if he hadn't blinked in a while. I screamed and jumped back against the wall. He didn't move, nor did his smile disappear. He looked giddy and completely deranged. I was freaking terrified. We stood like that for a few moments, neither of us saying a word. Finally, after what felt like forever, he slowly pulled his head back out of the shower, and I watched his blurry figure through the curtain as he moved backwards towards the bathroom door. A second later, the bathroom door slammed shut, hard enough to rattle the mirror. I screamed again and jumped out of the shower to lock the door. I stayed inside the bathroom for over an hour. Maybe I overreacted to some of you. But joke or not, I wasn't going to put up with the crazy stuff anymore. That's what I kept telling myself as I paced in my bathroom, stopping to listen at the door every few minutes. Suddenly, I heard a muffled sound, and I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, straining to listen. I couldn't hear anything, but I envisioned Chris standing on the other side of the door, giggling at his joke. I felt a surge of anger. I was beyond pissed at being made to feel scared in my own house, and made to hide in the bathroom for an hour. All for what? Some joke? If it was a joke, it was an awful one. "What the frick, Chris?" I snapped. "This stuff is getting really fricking annoying." I waited for him to apologize, or to call me a jerk, but instead I heard a faint moan. So quiet I wondered if I heard it at all, and then complete silence. "Chris," I called out, not able to even hide the shakiness in my voice. I got no response, just my own heavy breathing. "I swear to God, just fricking stop it," I yelled, pounding my fist on the door. I waited for him to cuss me out, something I would expect from me talking to him like that. I never screamed at him before, but there was nothing, just the occasional drip from the shower head. I won't deny that I was scared, too afraid to open the damn door and face my own husband. I waited another 30 minutes or so, which feels like a fricking lifetime when you're scared. Finally, I decided I wasn't going to spend the night hiding in my bathroom, so I got down on my knees and peered under the door. I almost expected to see his face peeking back at me, but thankfully I didn't. I could see straight down the hallway to the top of the stairs, but no Chris. I didn't know if I should be happy about that or not. I looked for a few minutes, waiting to see his head pop up over the top step, but it never came. I stood up, my hand hovering over the door, and mentally prepared myself to open it. I slowly turned the lock with shaky fingers, and was about to yank it open when I heard a sound that still makes me feel nauseous when I think about it. A moan, louder than before, but this time I was able to tell just where it was coming from. I turned my head to the closet door as if in slow motion, and locked eyes with my husband, who was peeking out at me from the slight gap. His eyes were still wide as ever, and his mouth was hanging open in the most grotesque, gaping smile I'd ever seen. I didn't even scream. I was too scared for even that. His hands were clasped to his chest, body trembling with delight, as if he could barely contain his excitement. A short, raspy moan bubbled up from his throat, deep and raw, sending a shiver through my entire body. Somehow, I found the ability to pull the bathroom door open and ran as fast as I could all the way down the steps, snagging my keys and phone from the table in the living room before running outside to my car. I could hear his shrill laughter behind me, but I didn't hear him getting closer. I didn't bother shutting the front door. I drove away from the house faster than I legally should have, shivering the entire time, either from fear or the cold, maybe a little of both. I hadn't grabbed a coat or even a pair of shoes. I was still in my panties and my hair was still damp. I drove straight to my brother Jack's house about 40 minutes away, ignoring any and every call and text I got. I didn't check my phone until I was safely parked in my brother's driveway. Chris had called 4 times and sent a flurry of texts, all wondering where I'd gone and why I left like that. I threw my phone at the dash in a rage, furious at his nonchalant attitude. My brother and his wife were surprised to see me, especially dressed in just a pair of panties, but told me to stay as long as I needed. His wife lent me some clothes and asked me what happened. I told her Chris and I had a fight but didn't get into the details. I didn't want her to think I was overreacting, leaving my husband over a prank, even if it was a strange one. I mean, hadn't I encouraged her for years to lighten up instead of being so serious all the time? I had wanted her to relax and loosen up, but this was definitely not what I'd had in mind. I tried to sleep on their sofa, but my brain wouldn't let me sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Chris's face staring at me from inside the closet. Knowing he'd been in there with me the entire time made my skin crawl. He'd never left the fricking bathroom at all. Instead, he slipped inside the closet and slammed the bathroom door shut to fool me. The mere thought of going back home gave me anxiety. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Jack ended up giving me a sleeping pill, so I was able to get a little rest. My sleep was filled with terrible dreams, all of Chris's smiling face. I woke up just as the sun started to rise. My sore body ached from the sofa, and I felt drained. I knew I'd have to call Chris at some point, but I didn't know what to say to him. I wouldn't be going home unless he gave me his word he'd never do any more creepy stuff. I just wanted my husband back. His normal, serious self never looked so good to me. I was contemplating calling him and telling him that, when that familiar feeling came over me. I was being watched. I was staring at the ceiling, my heart in my throat. I didn't want to look away, but the longer I ignored the feeling, the worse it got. My eyes drifted away from the ceiling almost on their own. His face was pressed up against the window beside the couch, staring down at me with that same gaping smile. Drool dribbled down his lips, leaving 2 long streaks down the glass. I didn't know how long he'd been there, but something told me he'd been there quite a while, possibly all night. I didn't bother screaming, though I was afraid anger trumped any fear I felt at that moment. I jumped up from the couch and pounded my palm against the glass. "Chris, are you crazy? What the hell is wrong with you? Just go home!" I shouted. "Now!" He didn't move, and his ghastly expression never changed. If anything, his smile only grew, as if he had never been more elated. I could hear Jack and his wife moving around upstairs, as if Chris could hear them from his place outside. His head twitched slightly in their direction, and he began to close his mouth slowly. Jack called my name from upstairs, obviously concerned. I turned to see him and his wife Rebecca hurrying down the steps. When I turned back to the window, Chris was gone. The only sign he'd been there at all was the 2 streaks of drool still dripping down the glass. I tried explaining to Jack and Rebecca about waking up to see Jack watching me through their window. They were skeptical. Who wouldn't be? Jack and I went outside to the spot in front of the window, but there were no footprints in the dirt, just a slight indent. Animal probably, Jack guessed, and I didn't argue. He and Rebecca assumed I dreamt the entire episode, but they didn't understand, and I was too tired to explain it to them. I called out of work that day and turned my cell off. I didn't want to face Chris. Just talking to him was too much for me at that point. I really started to believe something was irreversibly wrong with him, that no matter what promises he made, we'd never be the same again. The thought saddened me to my core. I cried most of the morning. By noon, I figured I was ready to confront him, give him one last chance to explain himself. I could at least give him that after 6 years, I told myself. I turned my phone on and saw the dozens of texts he'd sent, all from a seemingly concerned husband. "Can we talk? I love you. Please call me. I'm really worried. Can you answer? Just come home." And more of the same. All texts telling me he loved me and he wanted me home. How worried he was. Not a damn one addressing the crazy stuff he pulled. Like he hadn't been acting like a character from a Stephen King book. Even his texts were different. He normally texted novels just to tell me to pick up a loaf of bread. You'd think he'd have more to say to me after his bizarre shenanigans. I know it probably seems childish to some of you who are miles away from this situation, but if you saw the way Chris had looked at me, how he scampered away on all 4s like some wild animal, grinning at me from inside the closet like a lunatic, then I think you'd find my reaction was warranted. I ended up staying with Jack and Rebecca for another night. I didn't wake up yesterday until afternoon, and thankfully I didn't see Chris's face watching me through the window. I don't want to pry because it's not my place, but is this fight something that can be mended? Jack asked. He'd made us both a sandwich for lunch, and I knew he wanted to breach the subject without seeming to be nosy. I don't know. He's like a different person, I said, choosing my words carefully. I still wasn't ready for him or Rebecca to know the full extent of the craziness I had been dealing with. People change, but he's still the same man you married. Maybe you both just need to talk through your issues. Whatever's going on, I'm sure it can be fixed, he said. I think it's beyond that now. I don't think talking would help. I just don't trust him, I said. The words stung in my heart. I missed and loved my husband, but how could I live with someone like that? Living in constant fear didn't sound too appealing. Chris loves you. He has to be absolutely crushed, he said. I don't know about that, I said. Well, he certainly seemed like it to me. I've never seen him so upset. Very much unlike the Chris I know, Rebecca said, shaking her head sadly. It took a full minute for her words to really sink in, and when they did, I felt dread worming its way through my skin. Wait, what do you mean? You saw him? You saw Chris? I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Rebecca nodded casually as if that fact wasn't nightmare fuel. Maybe for her it wasn't. He stopped by this morning just after Jack left for work, she said, cleaning the plates from the table. I didn't see his car though. Maybe he took an Uber or something. Becca, what did he say? Did he come inside? I asked, sweat starting to break out on my forehead. I began looking around, examining corners as though a predator lurked behind them. No, he just asked if you were awake yet, and I said that you weren't. I asked if he wanted me to wake you, but he said no. Just said to let you sleep, she said as she washed the dishes. That's all? He didn't say anything else? I asked. No, he looked awful though, like he hadn't slept in days. I think you should call him. I got up from the table and thanked Rebecca for lunch. I felt a little bit better at the knowledge that at least he hadn't come inside. Still, I needed to double-check that the doors were locked. I sat for a while trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to go home, but I felt that I owed it to Chris to help him if I could. Hadn't I swore an oath to love and honor him through sickness and in health? Clearly he was very sick. If he was sick, which I truly believed he was, I had to try and get him the help he needed. But I didn't even know where to start. I didn't want to call the police, and besides, what the hell was I going to tell them? That my husband was peeking at me? That he was being creepy? As bizarre as he'd been, he still hadn't committed any crime. Not yet, anyway. The police would have probably said that I was overreacting, but this wasn't some prank. It felt wrong, dangerous even, like something sinister lurked beneath his smile. I knew as his wife I was well within my rights to have him committed, but what if he simply acted normal in their presence? He'd obviously been able to fool Rebecca into thinking he was just a concerned husband. As long as the doctors didn't find him a danger to himself or others, they'd have no choice but to release him after 72 hours. I felt lost and overwhelmed. So I did what any woman in my position would do. I called his mother. I didn't want to, believe me. His mother, Marianne, and I were never on the best of terms. We'd never fought or anything like that. She just wasn't a very warm person, and wasn't really easy to get along with. She hardly ever smiled, and when she did, only her lips would move into a thin-lipped smile, leaving her eyes as blank as before. She gave off this aura that felt like she was permanently on the offensive. I'd only met her twice, and both times were for such short visits. I got the impression she didn't approve of me for her son. Chris always pushed us out quickly, as he didn't want me to feel uncomfortable, which I was grateful for. Being in his mother's company felt almost unbearable, like walking on glass. I was glad when we moved 3 states away so we didn't have to see her often. I was happy to avoid the woman, but I needed her help. I really didn't want to talk to her at all, but I had to talk to someone, and someone who knew Chris better than I did. So I grit my teeth and did what I had to. Yes, she answered, already sounding irritated. Marianne, it's me, Gracie. Do you have a minute to talk? I asked. I could hear her cluck her tongue in irritation. I'm in the middle of writing some checks, but if you insist, I suppose I can spare a moment. What is it that you want to discuss, Grace? She said coolly. It's about Chris. He's been acting strangely, and I was wondering if you had any idea whether there was something. I was quickly interrupted. It's a bit difficult to follow your rambling, Gracie. What is that you want from me? She asked. I could almost see her standing there in her thin sweater and slacks, tapping her fingernails impatiently on the table. I wanted to know if you'd ever noticed any odd behavior, or possibly any mental health issues, I asked. There was a long, uncomfortable pause that I couldn't tell was because she was just thinking, or something else. Finally, after a few seconds, she spoke. I'm not sure if this is one of your jokes, Gracie, but if so, I don't find the humor in it. Now, I do have business to attend to, as I've said, so if you don't mind, she said, but I cut her off before she could get rid of me. Marianne, it's not a joke. I'm sincerely concerned about Chris's mental health. His behavior has been very erratic lately. I'm very worried about him, and I figured as his mother you would be as well, I said, my frustration evident in my voice. If you're truly concerned, then I suggest you get the health professionals involved. I don't know what you expect of me, she snapped. I could tell she was seconds away from hanging up, and for some reason I was desperate not to let her. I had the feeling that she knew a lot more than she was letting on. Please, if not for me, do it for Chris. I tried. I heard a faint shaky intake of breath, as if she was trying to hold her steely persona together but failing. Marianne, Gracie, I don't know what to tell you. My only advice would be to seek professional help. Do not call me again. Goodbye. I tried to call out to her, but she'd hung up. I tried to wrap my head around the call and her refusal to help me. even if she didn't like me. Why wouldn't she want to help her own son? I couldn't understand that. I tried to replay the conversation, desperate to find something I missed. After a while, I almost gave up, until I remembered her last words to me. Seek professional help. She'd said those words with a bit of urgency. I could have just been grasping at straws, but no, I was sure her voice had changed ever so slightly when she'd said that, as if they were very important. What had she meant? I assumed she'd been referring to medical professionals, but maybe she was referring to someone else. Someone that she didn't, for some reason, feel comfortable saying directly. Or maybe I was just desperate. I waited for Jack to get home, and after a very long and exhausting conversation with him and Rebecca, I convinced them that Chris truly needed psychiatric help. I didn't tell them everything. I wasn't prepared to go into it yet, but I told them about our last encounter, how he'd hidden in the bathroom, peeking at me from the closet. They were obviously shocked, but thankfully they believed me. They too just wanted to help him. Still, they didn't think it was all that serious. Weird, maybe, but not dangerous. They just kept saying that Chris had to be playing some kind of weird joke. Maybe for YouTube? Rebecca offered, if only half-heartedly. Jack didn't think we should involve the police just yet. He offered instead to go with me, and I readily accepted. He reasoned that calmly talking to him, trying to coax him into going willingly, was the best recourse. I agreed to do it his way. At least I wouldn't be going into that house alone. We drove over this morning, just after breakfast. There was no way I was going at night. When we pulled into the driveway, my stomach began doing somersaults. His car wasn't there, but I still didn't let my guard down. The front door was ajar, and for a split second I thought we'd see his eyes staring through the gap. I was shaking and starting to sweat. Jack, however, was fine. He waited for me to open the door, his hands in his pockets like he was going on a fricking stroll through the park. I envied his ignorance. I pushed the door open and was immediately hit with the stench of rot. Jack smelled it too, and he walked in the house behind me with his nose scrunched up. "What do you guys use to clean the floors around here?" Jack mumbled. "Shut up," I said, my eyes darting around for any signs of Chris. The house was deadly quiet and dark despite being 10 in the morning. All the curtains were closed up tight, refusing to allow any sunlight inside. If I hadn't left it just 2 days prior, I'd have thought the house to be abandoned. We moved through each room, carefully checking any place that he might hide, occasionally calling his name. "Why the frick are you looking under the couch?" Jack asked eventually. "Aren't we looking for your husband?" He was looking at me like I was a moron. "Let's just go upstairs," I whispered. He shook his head but followed me up the stairs to check the bathroom and spare bedroom. On the way up, my shoes crunched over pieces of glass that looked to be littered over a few of the steps. I noticed that one of Chris and my wedding portraits that hung on the wall along the staircase had been smashed. The frame hung crookedly, all the glass removed. I stared at the picture, a lump forming in my throat. We had taken the photo just after leaving the church. After saying our vows, I looked at Chris's beautiful face. I never dreamed his face would ever be a source of terror for me. We climbed the rest of the steps and checked the spare bedroom, but it looked completely untouched. I was hesitant to go into the bathroom, my fear from that night coming back to me all at once. Jack noticed and offered to go in by himself, but I couldn't let him do that. So we walked in together, checking the closet and the shower. The bathroom looked as if it hadn't been touched since the night I left. "I don't think he's home, Gracie. Why don't you pack some clothes and we'll try coming back tomorrow or something," Jack said. I nodded and went into our bedroom and shoved some clothes into a duffel bag. When I checked inside our closet, I came across the source of the smell and gagged. Jack took one look and lost all color in his face. He had to go stand by the stairs to get away from the sight and smell. I gazed down in shock at what lay inside my bedroom closet. Soaking into the rug were at least a dozen eyeballs, all carefully laid out in pairs. Some were as large as a quarter, while others were as tiny as a marble. I stared down at the eyes he'd collected from small animals, and I wondered how he'd gotten them, and shuddered at the thought. "Man, I thought I had it bad with Becca's shoe addiction, but frick me. Your husband's in home collecting eyeballs," Jack said, gagging. "Gracie, I think we should go," he called from the hall. "I'm getting nauseous." All right. I grabbed my duffel and shut the closet door on my new nightmare. I stepped out into the hall and took a deep breath of air. I could taste the rot on my tongue, and I couldn't help but gag. "Who the frick lines up eyeballs in their closet like that?" Jack mumbled. "I tried to tell you he needed help," I said. "He doesn't need help, Gracie. He needs a fricking exorcist," he said. "You coming or what? I can't stand the smell any—" His words died in his throat, and his eyes grew wide with fear. I didn't ask him why. I could feel it. Someone was watching me, and I didn't think it was the eyes in the closet. I turned around, my eyes slowly scanning the bedroom. "Christ," I whispered, as I finally saw what we'd missed. Under the bed, curled on his side, watching us with the excitement of a kid on Christmas morning, was my husband. He held his hands together just under his chin, and they were shaking eagerly. Now that he knew he'd been found, I could hear the quiet noises he was making, a sort of hiccuping sound in his throat, as if the excitement was just too much for him. It was unnerving to say the least. Wide eyes and that same huge smile. Everything in me told me to run, but I forced it away. This was my husband. No matter how twisted, he was still the man I married. I had to help him. "Chris," I said softly. He didn't respond, but his head bobbed back and forth in 2 quick little movements as if he was nodding. "Baby, I just want to help, okay? Can you let me do that?" I asked. I had taken a single step forward, approaching him like some kind of dangerous animal. "I love you, Chris," I said softly, taking another step closer. He let a tiny moan escape his wide-open mouth, and I had to resist the urge to run. His shoulders were starting to quiver, and his eyes grew as large as saucers. I crouched down so I could see him better, and immediately saw the blood. His hands were covered in it. They trembled more the closer I got, as if he was barely able to contain himself. "Chris, are you hurt? You're bleeding," I said. He bobbed his head again, his bloody fingers moving up and down as if playing an invisible piano. They occasionally grazed his chin, leaving smears of blood on his skin. I wanted to recoil in disgust. The smell that was coming off of him was revolting. I could feel the vomit trying to climb up my throat. His lips were dry and stretched thin, blood seeping between the cracks. I knew he wouldn't come out on his own, but I didn't want to leave him in the state he was in. I scooted closer and reached out to him. The excited, hiccuping sounds got louder and his hands shook, fingers flexing. It was then that I could see the blood oozing from in between his fingers. "Oh my God, Chris, you're bleeding," I said. Instinctively, I reached out to take his hand, but before I could even touch him, his hand sprang out towards me. A sharp pain shot through my arm, and I fell back on my butt. My arm burned, and I could see the blood dripping down onto the carpet. I looked back at him in shock and saw him grinning madly, his fingers clutching a large shard of glass. "You all right in there?" Jack asked from behind me. I turned my head slightly and nodded to him, cradling my arm to my chest. When I turned back to face Chris, I saw that his focus had shifted. He wasn't looking at me anymore, and he wasn't smiling anymore either. He was staring past me, him eyes glaring at Jack the way a hungry lion might stare at an antelope. His mouth was still hanging open, but it was twisted into a snarl. I got to my feet and began walking backwards down the hall, afraid to take my eyes off him. "Are you bleeding?" Jack asked. The moment the words left his mouth, Chris started fast scooting out from under the bed, the glass shard still in his fist. "Jack, run! Go!" I yelled. He must have been too afraid to move because a second later, I felt my back bump into him. He was still standing at the top of the stairs, staring at the horror that was my husband. Chris had crawled completely out from under the bed and stood in the bedroom doorway, his face twisted in rage. His whole body was visibly tense. Blood ran down his fingers and onto the floor. "Jesus, Chris," Jack said. "You, playing hide and seek?" I reached back and pushed him towards the steps. "Move your ass, Jack," I said as quietly but firmly as I could. Chris bobbed his head in fast, sharp motions and began to grin, stretching him mouth open wider and wider so that his chin seemed to touch his chest. I heard Chris mutter a prayer, and then he was running down the stairs. I stood at the top of the steps, stuck between the love for a man who clearly needed serious help and self-preservation. "I only want to help," I said, choking back tears. His eyes focused on me once again as he slowly lifted the glass, holding it out in front of him. And then he started sprinting towards me, grinning with utter excitement. Thankfully, my body took over and I flew down the stairs, skipping 2 or 3 at a time. I made it to the front door before I felt him leap onto my back, wrapping his arms around my neck, his open mouth next to my ear so that I could hear those terrible hiccuping sounds up close. I shook him off me, knocking him to the floor. I felt a searing pain in my back as he went, but I tore open the front door and bolted to my car. Jack was standing in the front yard, talking on the phone with the police. I didn't say a word. I just ran to my car and jumped in. Jack took the hint and followed me, still on the line with 911. I watched the rearview mirror, sure I'd see him there, running after us, but I never did. I went straight to the ER and got 11 stitches in my arm and 3 on my back. The police asked a lot of questions and went back to the house to do a search, but of course, Chris wasn't there. They advised me to stay with a friend or relative for a while and to file a restraining order as soon as I could, but none of those things would matter. Somehow I just knew. I dropped Jack off at home and went to a motel an hour away. I wanted to put as much distance between me and Chris as I could. This is where I've been for the last 4 hours. I thought maybe the police would find him. Maybe they'd get him the help he desperately needs. But now I don't think so, because 40 minutes ago I got a text from an unknown number, just 3 words, "I found you," and a picture attached. The picture was dark and grainy, but I instantly knew what it was. There was no mistaking my husband's eye. I started typing this out immediately after. I don't know what to do. I'm alone and scared. and I can't help but feel that I'm being watched.